Hello, this is Kathleen Ralph, creator of the webcomic Hope and Harry. I know how important support is for creators, which is why I support Andy and Derek and the Comics Alternative through Patreon.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 150. Reviews of The Six Voyages of Lone Sloane, Wolf, and Americatown. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking at three recent titles. We're going to start with The Six Voyages of Lone Sloane by Philippe Druillet. After that, we're going to look at the first two issues of Alice Cott and Matt Taylor's Wolf. And then after that, we're going to look at Americatown #1, written by Bradford Winters and Larry Cohen, with art by Daniel Irizarri. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes at 50% off cover price. But often you will find discounts that go higher than that.
Yeah, that's right. This month there's a bunch of bundles as usual. There's a couple of different August DC Returning Series bundles. One of them at 45% off, one at 50% off. We got Marvel Secret Wars bundle at 50% off, a Marvel Relaunch bundle at 50% off, Marvel Kids bundle at 50% off, a Valiant bundle at 50% off, even a Vertigo special bundle discount at 75% off. For 4 new Vertigo series.
Yeah, and that's insane. For the price of a regular one issue of a Vertigo title, you can get 4. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's a pretty good deal.
It is. And even though we are in the final days of August, you can still get incredible discounts through Discount Comic Book Service. And another good thing, Gene, is they don't mind late orders, which is a good thing because I know that this month I'm late with my August order. So they're really good guys there. You gotta check out their business if you haven't already. Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Sounds like a plan.
So, Gene, we opened the show at the very beginning, before anyone heard our voice, with a word of endorsement from one of our Patreon supporters. And this was Kathleen Ralph. She does a webcomic called Hope and Harry. And in fact, if you want to check it out, you can find it at hopeandharry.com. That's one word. hopeandharry.com. And she sent us a brief clip to say that the show was brought to listeners by Patreon supporters like her. And that's the case. One of the things we have invited our Patreon supporters to do is to send in a little clip where they say something similar. So every now and again, we will feature those at the very top of an episode. So I want to thank Kathleen and others for sending in these clips, and you will be hearing more in the coming weeks.
Yeah, it's cool. They get to have their voice along with our mellifluous tones. But we really do appreciate the support that we get from people because, as we were talking before the show, there's always some techno stuff that could always be tweaked and improved. But that unfortunately, tech is not free.
Exactly. So, yeah, we very much appreciate that. And if you do want to check out our Patreon campaign, you can do so by going to patreon.com/comicsalternative. That's www.patreon.com/comicsalternative. Or if you just go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you will definitely see a link there to our Patreon account. And you can find out what that's all about. And we appreciate the support from Kathleen and everyone else who is a Patreon supporter.
What that's all about. Learn. You see, we got PhDs. We teach people. You learn things by listening to the show.
That's right.
And even by finding out about how the show works.
Exactly. I also want to share a bit of mail that we received over the past week. And this was an email that I received to my personal Comics Alternative account. So it didn't go to two guys at Comics Alternative. It went to Derek at comicsalternative.com. And this is from listener Rick Granger. He writes, Derek, you are the Kevin Smith of comics podcasting. Thanks for all the hard work. I listen to everything. So, Rick, nice. Thank you very much for the kind words.
Somehow he's got a webcam on you and he sees that all you wear are sports jerseys.
Yeah, hockey jerseys especially, hockey jerseys. Yeah. But, yeah, you know, I really do appreciate the work of Kevin Smith, both in terms of his film work, his comics writing, and his podcasting. So I hope that by Rick thinking that I'm the Kevin Smith of comics podcasting, that's a good thing. And,
I'm sure it is.
And that Rick's not irritated by Kevin Smith. So, again, we appreciate people who not only support us through Patreon, but also who send us messages, either via email or Facebook, Twitter, or what have you. And that makes us feel that we're doing something right.
Yeah, it's pretty nice because we just you do this stuff and you never share like who's listening and stuff like that. So it's good to actually get feedback from actual physical people.
Exactly. So, Gene, do you want to get to the books that we're going to be discussing this week?
Yeah, looks like we're starting off with Philippe Druillet's The Six Voyages of Lone Sloane. This is a big hardcover that came out, I think, just last month, right, from Titan Comics?
You know, I think I looked at the official release. I think it's this month, but I saw maybe on Amazon a September release date. But
because I was seeing July in a lot of places, actually.
Okay.
Even on the Titan Comics website.
Okay, let's just say this is a late summer release then.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So, but I mean, really, this is a new book that is coming out through Titan. Although, in many ways, it is not a new book.
Yeah, right. This stems back to what 1972, I think, was the first edition of this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, or the first collection.
The first collection
of these stories came out in 1972 from Degas, the publisher, the French publisher. And the stories, the 6 stories, as you can tell from the title, The Six Voyages of Lone Sloane, originally came out between 1970 and 1971. And I think all 6 of these segments that make up The Six Voyages of Lone Sloane originally appeared in Pilote, the French comics magazine, which is a precursor of Heavy Metal or Metal Hulot. I'm sure my French accent is terrible there, and people are going to correct me as they have in the past. So yeah, so this started off with individual stories, shorter stories in Pilote, and was collected in 1972. And then Titan Comics is bringing this to a new English edition. Now, this is not the first English edition. I believe that NMB had an edition of this at one point, and I think Dark Horse also published Lone Sloane stories as well. Do you know if that's the case? That's possible. I'm not sure. I've got, not with me, it's still back in storage, but I've got one Druillet book, which I believe is actually in French. I'm not positive. I don't think it was an English translation, but it was kind of a late 70s, early 80s edition. And I wish I had it in front of me to make some comparisons. It's been so long I don't remember which Lone Sloane it actually was. Now, Lone Sloane is a character whose adventures span different volumes, and this is the first one that Titan Comics is putting out. And in fact, the character Lone Sloane first appeared in a work from Druillet in 1966, The Mystery of the Abyss. And it's curious that Titan is not beginning with that one, but they're starting with the 6 Voyages of Lone Sloane. And then I think the next 2 volumes that Titan Comics will be coming out with will be the Delirious. I think they're breaking that up into 2 volumes because at least on the very back cover of the book that we have, you can see that coming soon, Lone Sloane Delirious and Lone Sloane Delirious 2, and each of them with different ISBN numbers.
Yep. So that should be a clue that it's going to be 2 books.
Exactly. So so I guess what Titan's going to be doing is coming out with really new, nice, BD-sized English editions of the Lone Sloane stories. Yeah,
and this is in most respects a very, very beautiful book. Nice, big, lovely hardcover. And the art needs to be at this size. One of the things that I was kind of shocked at, in the back of the book, they have some kind of like bonus material, and one page shows 3 previous covers from 3 previous French editions. And that top one, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but that top one, those were like pocket paperback size editions. I cannot imagine that. And I got a few of these, like Jacques Tardy and things like that, and Claire Bertochet and a few others that I picked up when I was, when one travels in France, one picks up these things, and they're always like a rechopped down, like only a couple panels per page, heavily reformatted and stuff like that. I cannot imagine this book being given a treatment like that. I can't imagine how you could possibly read this in a smaller format and having the panels just a couple panels per page, because this just does not lend itself to that kind of treatment at all.
Yeah, you're right, and it's really good that Titan Comics is coming out with this large format edition to really let the art shine through. I can't imagine looking at this in a smaller size, because even with the page size that we have, there is so much art and even the words. Sometimes you have to get up close to read everything that's being said or everything that is written.
Two older guys with PhDs talking about comics.
Exactly. 2 older guys with PhDs whose eyesight isn't what it used to be. But even if we had very keen eyesight, really like younger readers may have, you would definitely need a larger edition to take in the art, because the 6 stories that make up the 6 Voyages of Lone Sloane, I mean, it is the art that carries everything. I mean, the stories, if you strip away the art and try to summarize the events that occur to the character Lone Sloane, that he did this, then he went there, and then he did something else. Okay, that's all of that first voyage. And then the second voyage, well, basically there are 2 or 3 things that he did, and then that's it. So there's not much story within each of these, or at least maybe that is not the best way of putting it. It's very condensed storytelling. In other words, this is the kind of comics story that we were used to when we were growing up.
To a certain extent, although even I'm not even sure about that, because his pacing is so bizarre. Because some pages will have half a dozen or a dozen panels on them. Some pages will be one gigantic panel. He plays with the page. There's a.
I'm talking about not so much the art, but the storytelling. In other words,
but for me, you can't really separate those two. The storytelling itself, the pacing. The rhythm of the storytelling changes a lot from page to page, from double page spread to double page spread, because of how the pages are constructed. It's okay. Some pages are more dense. Like I'm looking at one page. Page 11 has at least a dozen panels on it with tons and tons of text. But the page opposite, page 10, has 4 panels. One of the panels actually is tilted 90 degrees on its axis. So you have to actually turn the book to actually read the text in that one panel. You got the storytelling rhythms are just wildly separate, wildly crazy as you go through this book. This book is a psychedelic trip to look at and to read.
Yeah, I want to get to the psychedelic aspect, but granted, everything you said is spot on. I guess what I was doing is trying to make a distinction between this kind of storytelling, art, or even without the art, and more contemporary comic book storytelling that we've grown used to now. And I think I'll propose as examples the other two titles that we're discussing this week, Wolf and Americatown, because with both of those issues, with both of those titles, you have a story that is, I think, representative of most comics today, quite decompressed, and so in other words, it takes more page space to tell less story, to cover less story time, and at the same time, you don't have installments of a particular narrative that can easily or comfortably stand on its own. And with the kind of comics that you and I grew up with in the 1970s, especially, at least that I grew up with in the 1970s, each issue of a comic could stand on its own. And I think that the stories were I think they were significantly more compressed than the storytelling that we're used to comics, in today's culture. So that's the distinction that I was making.
Okay.
I'm not saying that, there is some kind of consistency or a lack of variation in storytelling style in Six Voyages of Lone Sloane. It's just that it's very different from what we're going to discuss later this week.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no question about that, definitely.
Yeah. And now, Gene, when you were growing up, did you read heavy metal?
No, it wasn't on my radar at all, unfortunately. I didn't discover it until far too much later.
I knew about it. I didn't read it when I was younger. And I guess one of the reasons why I didn't read it when I was younger is because I didn't have access to it. In some magazine shops, convenience stores, supermarkets, magazines like that were put back with more adult fare. I mean, not that it was necessarily, right next to the Playboys and Penthouses, but there was something quite risque about the heavy metal, and I'm talking about the English edition of heavy metal, not the original metal hurlant. But I knew it was out there, but I didn't read it. Although, and I don't remember specifics, but I do vaguely remember seeing bits and pieces of heavy metal here or there. So going through the Six Voyages of Lone Sloane, the art just kind of reminded me of some of this older kind of comic storytelling art. And that gets me to the point that you raised just a little while ago, and that is the psychedelic element. Now, this is coming out originally in the early 1970s. So to call something psychedelic, definitely makes sense, given the culture in the times, what was going on in Western culture in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't think, though, that this is the kind of psychedelic that we would find in, let's say, Sgt. Pepper's or even the film Yellow Submarine. It's a kind of psychedelic storytelling that is heavily, heavily infused by not only science fiction, but also fantasy. In fact, I would be hard-pressed to call this a sci-fi story, because I also want to call it a fantasy narrative, but it's a combination of those two with a lot of mind-bending psychedelia thrown in.
Oh yeah, but I've got no problem calling this science fiction. But this isn't the tradition. But you're right. It's science fiction, high fantasy. Elric, Michael Moorcock's Elric gets name checked literally in the pages of the book. In high school I devoured Michael Moorcock's Elric and some of his other books as well. But this is kind of a science fiction take on those same sorts of broad ideas of warring gods and the forces of chaos and order and things like that, all kind of glommed together. And one kind of lone champion whose job it is by fate to sail those seas. In this case, sail the interstellar seas and right wrongs, or kind of get caught up in these larger power games by these greater forces, greater than mortal forces. And as bizarre as that sounds, it looks even more bizarre and baroque and absolutely freaking beautiful on the page.
Yeah, and I like the way that you described it in terms of its detail, its baroque aspect, and because it is very intricate art, but very wild. In fact, to give our listeners a sense of how freaky wild that this book can get. If you look at the very first story or the first voyage of Sloane, The Throne of the Black God, and this is how it opens.
Yeah, that kind of gives you a little sense of what kind of story you're about to read with a title like that.
Yeah, it does. It says, the year 804 of the new era, after the Great Scare, men decided to spread their power over the universe. The infinite sea of stars wore the seal of the human empire. Great caravans of iron were launched to conquer the skies. Time passed, and few came back. The universe was keeping its secrets. But a tyran, a rogue among his kin, a loner, sails to the outer reaches of the great cosmic ocean. And, you mentioned earlier that this is very much like a sea voyage. And in that setup on the very first page, I mean, this is almost like a Ulysses story in a way. And we see this very elaborate drawing of Sloane as he's sitting in, I guess, the cockpit of his ship. He has his hand almost in an awkward position on some kind of control, and it looks very, very stylized. And you mentioned baroque, but then his ship explodes because it encounters this big stone black throne. And it's the throne that then transports him to a completely different world. So, I mean, it is wild, mind-tripping stuff.
Yeah, and seeing that throne, it just really puts me in the mind of, to get non-alternative for a second, Metreon in Jack Kirby's The New Gods.
Oh, yeah.
One of the characters who sits on a throne and travels space that way. And I would have little doubt that Kirby may have seen this, because I think that he was tied into some of the French stuff as well, even though he was like working 24 hours a day on cranking out comics at the time. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was some slight influence that way, because this would have come out before Kirby would have started The New Gods,
right?
This first story. Not to say that Kirby's ripping this off or anything, but it's a similar kind of theme in this kind of literal seat of power, which is kind of one of the keys to understanding the universe, which is what someone kind of gets thrown into. But yeah, that first page spread there that you're discussing, pages 8 and 9 in this book, you look at that, the bizarre way that he's using panels and stuff like that. That very first page, page 8. It's really interesting. You have to read the bottom tier of panels actually reads right to left instead of left to right, and he does that a few times throughout the text because he's leading your eye around the page in non-traditional ways. Even though it looks, some of the pages look like stained glass windows almost, and he's using the panels in a way that he wants to, not the way that we're expecting them. Exactly,
and I'm glad that you brought this up. Hey, another example of that is on page 21, and this is in that second story, the second voyage, The Wild Wind Isles. And here we have, standing in the very center of this page, or almost in the very center, the pirate Shanga. And Shanga and his men have picked up Sloane, who is out on this big black stone throne. Mm-hmm. And the way that the panels are laid out, now, you would normally begin on the left hand, in the upper left hand panel, then move down to what comes underneath, because to the right of that is the image of Shanga the pirate. And then I think maybe initially you would wonder, okay, I will read in a U pattern. starting at the top part of the left, moving down, then moving right toward the bottom, and then moving up. In other words, you would kind of go around this big imposing image of Shanga. However, if you read that way, things are going to get mixed up because the story doesn't flow that way. You go down the left side, then you go down the right side, and then you move from the right over toward the left, going through the bottom. So similar to what you pointed out earlier, reading right to left at times is what Druillet is asking us to do. So you have to get used to, as you pointed out earlier, different shifts in terms of storytelling style and panel layout. You have to be on your toes when reading this book, in other words.
Right, yeah. And again, and on that page, you're looking at page 21, he does actually use what some people call the cartoonist cheat of using arrows to lead you from one panel to the next. He's got those little tiny red triangles, which serve as as your guide to what panel to read next.
Right.
Which he doesn't do in some places. Some places you just have to figure it out. But another thing about this page, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work that Bart Beatty is doing up in Canada with Nick Susanis and a couple other people. They got this project called What Were Comics, and it's kind of this big number crunching thing that they're doing. They're kind of looking at the entire corpus of American comics, of American comic books, and trying to use kind of like a digital humanities tools to just number crunch and try to look at patterns. And one of the things they're looking at is like page layout and looking at the number of tiers per page in comics in different genres as you move across the 20th century. And page 21 here is doing something that they're looking at because you've got this kind of big figure in the middle, Shanga the pirate. It's kind of like this big enjambment on the page, and they've actually got one exhibit on their blog, which is another page that works similar to this. How do you read a page like this? That's one of the things that they're trying to figure out. How do you code a page like this? How do you count how many tiers are on this page? What does that thing in the middle do? Do you read that big thing in the middle more than once? It's an interesting way to look at how comics narratives actually work. And unfortunately, this is French, so this wouldn't fall into their project's purview. But it's the same type of thing. How do you quantify this? How do you describe to someone? You and I both try to describe how this page works. The only way really to understand it is to look at it visually.
Oh, exactly. And you point out just to stick on page 21 for a little longer. You do point out that there are the arrows that tell us where to go from one panel to the next, but to a point, because Druillet does not include that with every single panel. In fact, to me, when I was reading this, I was thinking that the panels that include the arrows, where to go from one to the next, are kind of the ones that were no-brainers. I mean, my eye would normally move in those directions. What was confusing is that, and I guess we could call it a strip or a tier at the bottom, instead of going from left to right, you go right to left, and there are no arrows including that. See, because I read that tier left to right as normal. I think you could do it, but if you read it also from right to left, things do make sense as well. So you would go down the left column, then down the right, and then go back left on that last tier, the very bottom of the page, and go from left to right. Yes. Okay. I think that works, but it also worked for me. Because the fourth panel down, Silence Coward, that's still Shanga talking. So if he goes to Silence Coward, and then if you read the next panel down, it seems to be that he's responding to himself. Okay, good point. Okay, that's a good. But again, the kind of Baroque and dreamlike nature of this narrative will make you ask those questions as you're going through these pages, because again, he will play those games all the way through. So yeah, it's that one example because I still think that had it not been for that one example that you pointed out, because I didn't realize at one point that was Shanga, because it's a close up of his face. Right, and but I guess there's that blanked out left eye. Yeah, it's the eye. I guess it's like an eye patch because he is a pirate, right? Right. But I didn't realize at first that was him because of the close up. But yeah, he wouldn't be responding to himself. So okay, that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, it just. underscore, I mean, our discussion of this and the clarifications and my little bit of confusion here just underscores the fact that this is not a traditional comic that you would read in any normal way, any ways that we're used to reading.
Yeah. No, it's not necessarily. Yeah. Normal is not a word that I think anybody would use to describe these comics.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned earlier that each of these 6 voyages are standalone, and they're several pages each, so you get in and you get out. And they originally appeared in that manner, so they came out in different issues of Pilote. But they are all interconnected, so what we find as the context at the end of one story is picked up on toward the beginning of the next. So, for instance, the transition between the very first voyage, which we mentioned was the one with the Black Throne, the Throne of the Black God. There's a reference at the very beginning, or toward the beginning of the Wild Wind Isles, about where Sloane was found and how he was found, and it was very similar to what happened at the very end of that first story. Same thing going from, let's say, for instance, from the third to the fourth story. The third one is Rose, and the fourth one is Torquedara Varencourt, the Bridge Over the Stars. And basically, we pick up on Sloane and his adventures really smoothly going from one to the other. So they're all interconnected. They're not just standalone stories, but each of them could conceivably stand by themselves and be a satisfying short narrative.
Right. Yeah. It's again, part of it is kind of like you said before about kind of an older comic storytelling. This is like each chapter is like an issue. It's kind of each chapter is a self-contained thing, but each chapter moves the plot forward. Exactly. So it's kind of like reading one issue of Amazing Spider-Man to the next. Mm-hmm. It's a full story, but it's all part of something bigger at the same time.
Yes. Now, let me ask you, of the 6 voyages or the 6 stories that we have in this volume, is there one that was more confusing to you than the others?
No. I don't think so. I was really, again, because I'd seen Druillet's work decades ago, and it was fine. It didn't matter much to me. This time, I was just happy to go along for the ride. I really loved the ride of this book, and if things were a little confusing, I would just kind of go back. And if I was confused, it gave me another opportunity to look at the art again. So I didn't find anything particularly more confusing than anything else. Or if I did, it was something that I worked out naturally through my reading, just because I loved looking at these pages.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that that's probably the best way of reading Druillet's work in this case, and that is just go along for the ride. And if you go through each page, even each panel meticulously, trying to ferret out exactly what's going on, I don't know if that's the best strategy for taking in his work. Maybe in rereading, that would be the way to go. But, at least the first time around, just read things both in terms of its text, but also, especially, though, in terms of the visuals, and just take the story in that way. But even given that, I do have to say that the one story that stood out to me as the most confusing of the 6 was O Siddhartha, which is the 5th of the voyages. And I think one of the reasons why this one, it was a little more difficult for me to wrap my brain around the sequence of events, is because we have characters in this story that are speaking a different language. And the way that Druillet is representing that is in a language that is not English. I mean, or in his original case, French. We can't read this, and so they're speaking in a completely alien language that we have no access to. Now, we can still figure out what they're meaning here, but I think that things like that kind of contributed to at least this story for me being a little more confusing than the others.
Okay, and we'll see. For me, it's not completely incomprehensible, because their speech is a mix of a kind of a very strange speech pattern English in translation. Again, the original would have been French, and this kind of asemic text.
I'm not saying it's completely incomprehensible. I was just saying if I'm comparing and contrasting stories, and if I had to pick one that was more confusing or I'm less apt to understand in a satisfactory way, it would be this one. And I think that language is only part of it. To me, a bigger issue I was going to mention is the fact that there seems to be more backstory with this voyage, this fifth installment in the book, than the others, because there is a past relationship between Sloane and the race that he encounters here, and we can ferret that out as the story goes along, but still, I think because of this backstory, it requires a little more effort to figure out what's going on here.
Yeah, possibly. So it's a little less just the action on the page or the visuals on the page. It's a little more ferreting out what the words actually mean and kind of like what people are referring to that isn't directly in front of our eyes. Because so much of what happens in the first 4 stories is what happens directly in front of our eyes on the page.
Exactly.
And it's like even the narration or the dialogue is kind of describing what's happening or reinforcing what's happening, rather than narrating a story that's beyond what we see on the page itself.
Exactly. And, one of the reasons why I wanted to mention this is not just to point out for the sake of pointing it out that, this is the one story of the 6 that I found the most difficult to get around. It's not so much that as I think it tells me something about where Druillet is going in his storytelling and as he is developing the narrative world of Lone Sloane. It just seems to me that in the earlier stories, as you mentioned, whatever we have on the page, the story that's unfolding, the visuals and all of that, that's basically what we have to contend with. But as we get later in the book, specifically for me, that 5th story, the 5th voyage, what Druillet is doing is he's starting to create a more elaborate world for his protagonist. So I'm really looking forward to see what we find in Delirious. I would guess, not having read Delirious or any Lone Sloane past what we have in this first volume, The 6 Voyages of Lone Sloane, that the world becomes even more sophisticated, more elaborate, and more filled with backstory and context.
Oh, yeah, especially since the next books are Delirious 1 and 2. I'm guessing that means it's maybe less episodic and more kind of one larger narrative. So it does kind of feel like, he's working his way up to he's exploring the world and then trying to deepen it as you move through this first volume, definitely.
Right. So are you going to go seek out Delirious and Delirious 2 when these come out?
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I am too. They're beautiful books. And, I want to say a few things about Titan Comics as well, because relatively speaking, Titan is a new kid on the block.
On these shores, at least.
On these shores, right. And, but even in the UK, Titan is starting to do more with more than they had in the past. Mm-hmm. If you look over the past year, let's say, or year and a half in the various monthly preview catalogs, you will see that the Titan solicitations are getting more and more substantial, that they're coming out with more reprints like this, but also they're coming out with new titles, brand new titles. Another thing that Titan did that I think was quite impressive is they took over the Doctor Who franchise from IDW. Now, I really enjoyed the IDW Doctor Who, and you and I have even talked on this podcast about Doctor Who from IDW, right? We did the,
that long 13-part story.
Yeah, the Prisoners of Time collection, which I thought was really good. But Titan has done a really good job in picking up the Doctor Who franchise. So whether it is reprinting older material like Druillet's work, or publishing franchises or licensed comics like Doctor Who, or coming up with completely new titles, I think that Titan is doing more and more over the past several months, year and a half or so, and I've become more impressed with them. I'm looking at the most recent previews catalog in the Titan section, and I see multiple Doctor Who comics. They have one for 5 different doctors. There is the series Bloodthirsty. There's the licensed property Blacklist. There's a volume of Death Sentence. There is Samurai, Man Plus, Scarlet Couture, Rivers of London, Shrek, Kung Fu Panda, Home. I mean, these guys are all over the place with original titles as well as licensed properties.
Yeah, I haven't followed a lot of their more recent stuff, so this is good. A couple of things there's a couple quality control things they should look into. Like the one thing that kind of bugged me was that you got that letter from Hergé in the back of the book, a letter from Hergé from 1972 congratulating Druillet on the publication of this book. It's in French. To read Hergé's letter to Philippe Druillet in French, to read the letter in English, visit, and then they give you a URL. Number one, it's not a complete URL because it just says Titan-Comics/ There's not even a .com or a .co.uk on it. And then if you figure out the .com and then go to that page, there's nothing there. And I thought maybe at first it was because the book hadn't officially launched yet, but it has launched. So if you want to find your English translation for the letter, which they tell you to look for on their own website, it's not there. So that was a little frustrating too.
They need a more careful editor.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a great idea to have that kind of stuff in there, and rather than take up twice the space on the page to give the original letter, because we're actually seeing a scan of the actual letter with Hergé's signature. It's a great idea, and then we can easily put a translation on the website. Cool. But if you're going to tell us that you do that, please do that.
Exactly.
And also the hobo lettering throughout really bugged me. There's some of the display text is in this typeface called hobo, which is usually found on in cheap stores and things like that. I actually see it all over Chicago at this point. But I'm not sure if the original looked like that or not. Some of their display text in here, anything that's hand lettered looks great, and even the regular even the regular dialogue text and narration lettering, which probably is a font, but the typeface, it looks really good. But when they get into some of the larger letters where people are shouting and things like that, or large sound effects, and it jumps into these weird like outlined red letters that are usually in this horrible cheesy 70s typeface called hobo. Again, maybe that's what the original looked like. I don't know, but it just kind of jerked my head off because it looks so weird compared to these intricately designed pages to have this weird, obvious typeface thrown in the middle of it. But that's just me because I'm a type nerd.
Yeah, you've mentioned before on the show that you're a type nerd.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, and here is where it would help to search out some of the earlier English editions of Lone Sloane to see if this is something that was in those earlier, let's say maybe Dark Horse or NBM editions, or if this is something that Titan is doing.
Yeah, I don't know. And there's a couple of places where the coloring is, especially on some of the narration blocks, the background color is like this kind of a deep brown. And it was really hard to read, and I couldn't tell. If again, that may just be a holdover from the original, because I'm doubting these things are recolored. I'm sure this is the original colors, so that's probably not the current production issue. That's kind of a holdover from what things used to look like. But there's a couple of places that were a little hard to read, not just because of the size of the text, but because there just wasn't enough contrast between the text and the background. And again, I'm pretty sure that just goes back to the original coloring. So that's what it is. Yeah,
I noticed that as well. It didn't bother me because in the back of my mind, I was thinking it's probably the original.
Yeah.
So, just deal with it. That's what I was thinking. But yeah, I really do like the 6 Voyages of Lone Sloane and look forward to the next 2 in the series, Delirious and Delirious 2.
Yeah, and one last thing I noticed, because like I said, one of the cool things about the book also is that you got all this extra stuff in the back, some photos of statues that Druillet did of some of the characters, and also they got the one page of music, a album called Grail from a group called Grail from 1972 or so, which uses images from the 6 Voyages of Lone Sloane on the sleeve artwork. That album is available on Spotify. And if you like your prog rock, if you like your rock very proggy at all, I would say go ahead and take a listen, because it's a lot of fun. A little more sitar, a little less keyboard than some of the prog that I'm used to, but I'm no prog expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I like it a lot. and reading comics got me to listen to the music, which was there on Spotify. So I was able to branch out my horizons that way.
So there you go, a Spotify recommendation from Gene. So do you want to look at the next title that we're going to be discussing for this week, Wolf?
Wolf, yes.
Yes. And this is written by Alice Cott with art by Matt Taylor, who has worked with Cott before on Zero. And the colorist in Wolf is Lee Logridge. So I don't know if it's pronounced Logridge or Lowridge. Loughridge.
I would tend to say Lowridge, but I have no... I'm not positive.
Exactly. So now this is another kind of freaky narrative in its own way, in a different way from Six Voyages of Lone Sloane. And it's also similar in that it's a mashup. This is not just one genre that we're looking at here. There's several things going on. So there's a little bit of horror. There's a little bit of noir going on. The story in Wolf takes place in Los Angeles. Let me ask you this. Now, we're discussing issues number 1 and 2 of Wolf. Issue 1 came out last month, 2 just recently. In the past week or so came out. When you were reading, let's say, the first issue, which is oversized. I mean, you get about 60 pages of story for this first issue, which is great. You'll find that in a lot of Image comics, and this, by the way, is Image. So that's great. But by the end of this first issue, did you have a clear sense of what Wolf is about?
Not much. a little bit, but we've talked about this before. The notion of the first issue of a series. How much should you know? How much should you be left wanting to know? This kind of felt, especially after 60 pages, I felt like at this point I should have had a much clearer understanding of what was going on than I actually got from it. 60 pages was a lot. It's a lot of pages, but the storytelling, as you talked about earlier, is what they call decompressed. And it's decompressed, and it's also, I'm not even sure elusive is the right word. It's just, it felt thin on the ground to me. And because we've got almost 90 pages from these first from these first 2 issues, and that's a huge chunk of story. And even after the second issue, I have a vague sense of what's going on, but it seems like a long way to go for not as much as I would have hoped in that length of a journey.
Yeah. Actually, you bringing in the second issue, because I'd ask you specifically about the first one, given the fact that we have an oversized, almost 60 pages worth of a first issue, did you get a sense of really what's going on? But you brought in the second, and you say even by the end of the second, which is a regular sized, I guess, issue, you didn't you still don't have a full sense. I feel the same way, but I think I would think that in the first issue, for it to be about 60 pages, we should, as readers being introduced to this new series, have a clearer sense of what all's going on. And maybe it's the way you and I are reading. Maybe we're not taking in what other readers can, but I think your feeling of this is very similar to mine. I had more questions than otherwise by the time I got to the end of issue number 1. Maybe fewer questions by the end of issue 2. But this is one of those titles, and I do like it. I am engaged in the narrative, and I want to read more. So I do like Wolf. But that being said, this is one of those new titles that after I read the first couple of issues, I thought, well, maybe I can go on the web to look at what other people are saying about this, look at reviews or write-ups of the first and second issue, maybe look at an interview or 2 with Cott just to find out what is going on and to get a fuller sense. And really, you shouldn't have to do that when it comes to a first issue or 2, Yeah,
and like one thing... this isn't a spoiler because it's actually on the back cover, but I didn't read the back cover of issue 1 until I finished reading the whole thing. And it mentions an orphan teenage girl. I didn't really get the fact that she was orphaned, because the circumstances around that orphaning were they were just drawn, and there's almost no text to describe really what the hell's. I mean, I know she's there. There are dead bodies. Did I know that these were her parents? I couldn't get that. I don't think I got that from the story itself. Perhaps I just missed it. But once I got to the back cover, I was like, oh, that's what's going on there. And that was weird to me.
That's a good point. And in fact, and we're looking at digital copies here, and we have no page numbers. I think I assumed that those were her parents, but you're right. They're not spelling this out clearly, because this comes, I don't know, about 20 some pages into the story. And you find this young girl who is standing over the bodies of two people. She's got blood on her, and she has this dazed look on her face. And the officers, the investigators, the detectives around her are all talking. But our eyes are centered on her as she kind of stands there dazed. And so it's almost like as readers, we're in the position that she's in, right? Kind of dazed in terms of figuring out what is going on here. Now, I just assumed that those were her parents or people she was closely connected to in some way. But you're right. It doesn't spell out who they are.
Yeah, and it does call her a girl. And she does seem kind of shorter than everybody else, but honestly, the art wasn't clear enough for me to realize that when they say girl, was this a girl, or was this just using girl for female as opposed to woman?
Right.
I didn't really get that. And again, the art is fine, but sometimes if you're going to rely that much on the art, I would like to see things just kind of like maybe stage out a little more clearly for my taste.
Mm-hmm. Now, this girl that we've been talking about, her name is Anita Christ, or maybe even Christ. It could be pronounced that way. And if that phonetically sounds similar to Antichrist, well, that's no accident. Because
as we sort of learn in the second issue.
Exactly. That there's something going on here. And in fact, the way that I just phrased that, we learn by the end here and then into the second that there's something going on. I think that's probably the best way of describing the way that Cott reveals bits and pieces of this narrative world, because when this story opens, we see the main character, who we find out later is named Antoine Wolfe, with an E, and he is overlooking L.A., and he's on fire. And he's singing a Robert Johnson song. What is it? Hellhound on My Trail or something. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hellhound on My Trail. And you're asking yourself, okay, what's going on here? And then you find out later that, yeah, it was actually him. And he is in a straitjacket. And in one of these pages, we can see that he was burning, but he is healing from this. And so there's something different about him. So he's almost some kind of, supernatural kind of character. And then as the story in this first issue continues, we're introduced to other situations, bits of information, and scenarios. Because I think the first place that I was first really freaked out was a little more than halfway in. And this is not long after we see Anita being taken home by the detectives, and she jumps out of the car. And then Antoine is at home. There's a knock at his door, and it's a friend of his. This guy, Freddie Catonic? And he has this Cthulhu squid face. And at first I thought, okay, this is a guy wearing a mask. No, that's who he is. That's his face. And it was at this point that it really hit me that, okay, this is a very different narrative world. But here we are, actually about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the way through, now that I look at this, in this first issue. And we're still learning more and being surprised by things that are going on. And I think that that's intentional. I don't want to suggest that this is a storytelling weakness on Cott's part, because I think that this is what Cott is attempting to do, self-consciously so, and maybe mischievously so, because it's soon after this scene that I just described that we get a couple of completely black pages with just a few words over it. And this is like the artist himself or the storyteller stepping in momentarily to talk with us, the reader. Because you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. The story pauses at one point, and then you get a completely blank page with the words in the middle, kind of small. Don't worry, we'll come back to that. You know, when Antoine is talking with, we realize, a couple of vampires, and then you turn the page, chapter 2, later that night, and then we get to an interaction between Antoine and Anita, and then after that, it's the end.
Issue's over.
Issue's over. But then in the second issue, we get something similar, where this, I guess, narrative voice comes in several pages in and says, back to, later that night. No, it's not that confusing. And then you turn the page. Seriously, it's not. And then we pick back up. In other words, what God is doing here is he's having fun with how he reveals information to the reader and how he's telling the story. Now, I think that worked fairly well. How did you take that kind of mischievousness of storytelling?
It didn't work as well for me. It was very much like, see what I'm doing here, rather than just doing it. And I know I complained before that things weren't clear enough, but this was like it felt like it felt almost like a condescending holding my hand as a reader. So it's trying to do both things, either trying to be really, really unclear, or trying to be super clear and letting you know that it's being super clear and really I'm holding your hand. I'm showing you exactly what you need to know. It felt really strange to me.
I could see that, and I would agree with that if I weren't holding out hope in a way that you're probably not holding hope out for this story. Okay, what I mean by that. If in subsequent issues, and I don't think that this is a miniseries or with a particular endpoint, I think that this is going to be an ongoing. So it's not going to be a limited series. If, as this story develops, we get more of these authorial intrusions or narrator intrusions, where the narrator, him or itself, let's say, becomes part of the story, becomes almost like a character, where we're wondering, well, is this Alice Cott himself, or maybe it's a persona that he's using, or someone else entirely? What's going on here? So if that storytelling device, or the narrator with, who's speaking on these blank or black pages, if that becomes, so to speak, a character or a device that is used in subsequent issues, that's where I'm hopeful. But if this is once in a blue moon, Cott stepping in as storyteller in almost a condescending way, as you point out, and telling us that, okay, here, I'm going to hold your hand. Don't worry, it may be confusing. Just stick with me in this story and everything will make sense later. That will be a little disappointing. But what I'm hoping is that the storyteller or the narrator, him, her, itself, becomes a character or at least some kind of element of this story that returns.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I guess for me, this is a story that really, serialization seems to do a disservice for me. This is something I have a feeling I would like this a lot better if I could just read the whole story. But again, like you said, it may not be a limited series. It may be an ongoing. But I think, if nothing else, I think it's going to read better in larger chunks, because it feels so much like, between the hints and, like, again, that the playful narrative voice, which is it a one-time thing, or like you said, maybe it's going to be more consistent all the way through, in which case it might develop itself that way also. This doesn't really feel like serially is the best way to read this story, for me at least.
Yeah, this may be one that for many readers would be better in trade. So if you were looking for an excuse to trade weight, this may be a title that you could do that with. Yeah,
I think that's where I'm headed on this one, definitely.
What do you think about the infusion of race into this story in the first two issues that we have?
Pretty subtle. To be honest, I don't remember. I don't remember a whole lot about it. I'm just going to go through my notes here. There's not a. It didn't feel like it was really touched on that much, unless I'm just forgetting.
I think it becomes quite apparent in that first issue, not so much in the second. Remember when fairly early on, after we see Antoine on fire in the opening pages, and then he's talking with a couple of guys, one man has a speech impediment and he can't say, I think, R's clearly, and he pronounces them as F's. So at times you have to read carefully to understand what he's saying. But then his boss, or someone who oversees whatever he's doing, seems the head honcho is more clearly a racist. He's like a neo-Nazi.
Oh, that's true.
A race supremacist.
I forgot.
And
And
the N-word is used at least a couple of times. Now, the reason I mention this is I was looking at a couple of interviews with Cott on this title, and he had mentions that race is a part of this story, maybe not as much as in his other titles. I think most prominently Material, which is another Image title that started earlier than Wolf, but it's there nonetheless. So I'm curious how race is going to play itself out here, especially given the fact that the setting for this is Los Angeles.
Yeah, I guess to me it just felt like a small character moment. It didn't feel like it was any kind of thematic thing happening in the book itself, and it was easy for me to kind of read past it because it didn't seem to hold much weight for me as a reader.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if it's going to play more of a role because issue number 2 ends with a private prison, and because of race and incarceration, being issues that are quite popular in the media nowadays, I'm wondering if Cott is going to play that out a little more prominently in subsequent issues. I don't know. But I'm with you in that race is a part of this, but it's not a prominent theme that's woven throughout these first 2 issues, but it's there. And I'm wondering if Cott is just going to tease this out more as the series continues.
Yeah, I could see where that could grow into something, but it's so slight at this point that it slipped my mind after reading it because it just felt like it was just a passing moment, sort of.
Yeah. Much more prominent is the supernatural and noir element of the story. Right.
Yeah. That's kind of the pitch. It's a supernatural noir, very LA. It's a very LA story. But again, it's very supernatural, but so far more hints than the second issue really brings in the vampires and stuff like that a lot more directly, but still it just really feels more like it's just teasing us along rather than getting to the story itself. That was my response to it.
So this is one, if you continue on with it, it'll be a trade.
Definitely.
Yeah. Maybe so with me as well. I don't know. I have a bad habit of starting series, but then getting wrapped up in other readings, more times than not for the podcast, and then not keeping up with the monthly ongoings as I'd like to.
Yeah, well, it's hard, and it's also expensive.
Yes, exactly. So, Gene, you want to move on to Americatown #1?
Yeah, just bring that up over here.
Now, this is written by Bradford Winters and Larry Cohen, illustrated by Daniel Irizarri, and the colorist on Americatown is Matt Battaglia. So this is one that actually I remember when this was solicited a couple of months ago in previews, 2 or 3 months ago in previews. It's one that caught my attention just because of its premise. And here you have a situation where Americans, because of the economic situation in the United States, they are the ones who are emigrating to other countries illegally in many cases in order to find work, in order to send money back to their families in the U.S. Especially given the times that we're living in now, as everyone's gearing up for the 2016 election, especially what's going on within the Republican primaries now, with the emphasis, thanks to Donald Trump, on immigration. I think this is a timely title in that it inverts the situation that a lot of people see here today in the United States. We have an immigration problem. Whether you agree with that or not, what Winters and Cohen do in Americatown is they invert that, in that the immigration problem is not in the U.S., it's the United States citizens who become the perpetrators of immigration problems in other countries. Buenos Aires is where the action takes place in issue number 1 of Americatown. Right. Yeah. And again, the reason why people are immigrants, why Americans are immigrants in the first place, is not entirely clear. I mean, you made it sound like it's because of economic issues in America. Do they really hit that very clearly in this issue? No, you're right. They don't. And I guess I was speaking from just a supposition. I assumed that it was for economic reasons why Americans were going to other countries and then working illegally. It may be for other reasons. I just assumed that it was for economic reasons. It's a valid assumption, but again, we're not told why. We're not really told why all this is happening. Yeah, and that gets to one of the larger issues that I think you and I, before we started to record, both of us agreed that this would be a point of discussion with Americatown number 1, is the amount of information, the amount of story, the amount of setup that we get in issue number 1 really doesn't measure up to what I was expecting. And I can't remember the solicit by heart, obviously. I don't commit these things to memory. But a few months ago, when this was solicited in previews, the premise was much more explicit. And by the way, this is a Boom Studios Archaea title. And, Boom, I don't know if you look at the previews catalog, but I'm not overly pleased with how Boom arranges their solicits. It's like why we like it, why you will like it, and sometimes in the way that they kind of fragment the solicitation, it's not clear what the title really is about. Although I think that with Americatown number 1, they did a pretty good job of setting things up, and that's what captured my attention. But by the time I got to the end of issue number 1, I had a lot of questions, kind of similar to the way that both of us had questions with what was going on even after the second issue of Wolf. Yeah, to me the questions, now that we talk about, I don't think my questions are quite as dire with this one as it was with Wolf. Mostly just because we had so much more space to deal with in Wolf, and there were still so many questions left unanswered. I think this gives us a bit more information, especially compared to like the first 20-some issues, first 20-some pages of Wolf number 1. I've got a much better idea of kind of who some of these characters are, not necessarily why they're doing what they're doing, but at least what they're doing, which wasn't always clear to me in Wolf. But it's not. We're still clearly at the very beginning of something, and this one does advertise itself as the first of an 8-issue series. So this is not. This is not a continuing series. So this is chapter 1 of 8. Right. So it's our introduction to this, and it's a story that presumably will have an end, or at least a kind of end. Maybe this is Americatown. Maybe it's just volume 1 too. Who knows? But it's clearly trying to introduce a lot of things at one time. Yeah. And in fact, issue 1 begins with a group of, I'm assuming they're all Americans, and they're in a submarine, and they're on their way to Buenos Aires. And, they mentioned that, they've been traveling for a long time. One of them is really seasick. When are we going to get there? And so they're being transported across borders, so to speak, by these immigration smugglers. And of course, this is their business, right? And so they instruct the Americans, they give all of them burners, and they say, okay, you have one call to make, and you need to use this burner in that one call for you to call back home and tell them to go ahead and wire the agreed upon prearranged amount into our account, and then, you can go upon your way. We'll let you go. And so that's where things begin. And then along the way, fairly early on, within the first 10 pages, we realize, and I don't think this is a spoiler because you do see this fairly early on, that one of the Americans on the boat is the father of one of the, as he's called, a newbie smuggler.
Right.
And the son is going by a different name. He's going by the name Derek, and it's spelled the same way as mine. That's why I remember that. And of course, the son is wanting to help his father. The father, tries to connect back with his daughter and, his wife. Later on in this first issue, there's a complication. People are on the run. The authorities are after them. So I think that there's a lot of action in this first issue, but as you pointed out early on, there's certain questions, though, that after issue number 1 are still left unanswered. For instance, what is the economic situation back in the U.S., and why exactly are these guys, going to another country illegally to risk deportation and maybe worse? For what reasons?
Right. Yeah. We've got the what happening. We don't really have much of a how yet.
Right.
And I know. I'm sure that's part of the reveal as the story goes through. But if we're positing this kind of alternative scenario, I'd like to kind of know what the basis of it is, and we don't get much of that here at all yet.
Yeah, and one of the questions I would have, or another question that I would have, is why South America? Why is this group of people trying to find work in South America instead of going other places like maybe Asia or over to Europe? To me, one of the answers to that could possibly be, I don't know, I'll have to read the series, the subsequent issues to see how things unfold. But, this gets back to that inversion of the political situation that we're living in today, where many Americans feel that there's an immigration problem, but the immigration problem is not just immigrants from all over. It's from Mexicans or South Americans in a broader sense. So, there's definitely an ethnic thing going on in today's political culture. And so I'm wondering if Winters and Cohen are intentionally inverting geographically the direction of the immigration issue.
Yeah, that would certainly make sense. And that's something that I would hope would get explored more as the series goes on. But you're right; we don't really know. Again, it's one of the whys. We don't really know the why. We don't know why the Americans are leaving, and we don't know why they're going where they're going yet.
Exactly. But this is one that definitely sounds interesting, and I'm intrigued by the concept and interesting to see how it plays out. Now, this is one of those, I don't know if I'm going to go on to read subsequent issues, if I'll wait until all 8 issues are out to read everything in one sitting, let's say, or at one time, once we have all the story completed, or at least the first volume of the story.
I might actually, this was the one I was least interested in from the description beforehand, but I think I'm more interested in this than I am in following along month by month with Wolf, something like that. And one of the reasons also is just visually, I think this is a much more interesting book. I like looking at these pages a lot more. The art, the line art is kind of lush and a little cartoony for this topic, possibly. I mean, it's still fairly realistic, but at the same time, we've got kind of a thicker strokes, and some of the facial expressions are a little more bold and direct than you would expect from something that seems to be kind of this kind of high concept sort of thing. But it looks good, and the use of color is really interesting in this book. I love how the kind of the moody sense of color for sense of place and shifting scenes and stuff like that. It's not a normal traditional realistic use of color. It's a lot more impressionistic, and I like it a lot.
Right, the browns and the muted aquas or blues, and the pinks as well. I agree with that, and I agree with your description of the art not being what I originally expected, more cartoony, but not in a bad way.
Right, yeah, it's not a pejorative at all. It's more expressive, I think, than normally you get in a story like this. And I think that's good because it helps. Like I'm looking at just page in our version here, pages 15 and 16 right now. The eyes are kind of big in some places, but that really helps to carry. It's not like a really manga eyes, but at the same time, the eyes are very expressive in this case. And the faces can be expressive in a way that a thing that was maybe a little more stately drawn, you wouldn't get those emotions passing across people's faces as clearly as we do here. This is one where if there's not as much text on a page, sometimes it doesn't matter as much because the drawing gives us a lot more information about what these characters are thinking and feeling.
Right. Yeah, now there's but there was a part of this first issue, and I want to focus on this for a moment. This had me a little confused. I mean, more or less I can figure out what's going on. But
I'm pretty sure I know which page you're talking about, but go ahead.
Yeah, this is, I guess, about halfway through the issue, and this is when one of the smugglers, and I don't know his name, but he's the least pleasant of the three that we know. And he goes down into the basement where they're keeping one of the Americans. Is this the section that you anticipated me bringing up?
What they call the sob stories.
Yeah, and this is someone. It's a young woman, and she couldn't reach her contact back home on the burner, and in other words, to say, "Hey, can you transfer the funds?" And so until she contacts, I don't know if it's her father or a family member or someone that's going to be wiring the money, she can't get away. So they have her down in the basement. Now, to me, the confusing part comes when one of the smugglers comes down to the basement with her, and we see that he has taken her and he has her strapped to a chair, and he's sitting in front of a computer, and there's some kind of weird robot device that springs to life. And then a couple of panels later, we don't know how she got this way. I mean, it just happened suddenly. All of a sudden, her shirt is undone, or partly, so you can see her bra. She has a ball gag in her mouth. She's screaming, and this robot thing is behind her, both grabbing her, and there's some kind of drill injection device that's behind her. I don't know if that's going into her back or if it's going into her butt. I don't know. And as this is happening, and this is an action scene, you get the smuggler sitting at his laptop, and he says, "Extraction complete. Place your bids." And we don't know exactly what's going on. We find out later that he's trying to do something. He's trying to extract money somehow from her since she can't make the fund transfer herself with her contact back home. And so somehow he is going to use her to make money. Is he going to sell her? Is he going to sell whatever's being extracted from her? And if it's something that's being extracted from her, then why is her top halfway undone and does she have a ball gag? I mean, where did this come from? What's going on here? I don't know. I just had all these questions. It's like there's a lot of action here. This is one of the most intense moments of this first issue, but I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, you're right. It's kind of it's sort of a big action. Well, it's vaguely an action piece, but yeah, I've got a big question mark in my notes next to this one also. And yeah, the thing a few pages later kind of explains a little bit what might be going on. But yeah, it's a weird extra bit of technology that I was not expecting. We do have what are called holophones or whatever instead. So it's kind of a video phone, but it's a holograph. So clearly that this is kind of some kind of a future thing. So there's future tech around, but this robot comes sort of almost out of nowhere. It's hinted at a couple pages before, but really it seems like it's a strange thing to show up in a story like this. I wasn't expecting something like this to show up. And again, it's not entirely clear.
Yeah, you mentioned the technology. Later in this issue, drones make an appearance. And
right.
I mean, that's not, completely futuristic because we're living in a world with drones now. But the way that the drone is being used in this case is something fairly futuristic, maybe not too far in the future, given the way things are going. But,
right,
they're used by the Immigration Bureau down in Argentina as well. Yeah,
so that didn't really strike me as all that strange, just because, again, you listen to the news in the morning, drones show up all the time.
Exactly.
So but again, you're right. It's kind of a drone plus sort of, but at the same time, it's really clearly an extraction in this sort of scenario that does not seem at all strange. The robot seems strange. The drone to me didn't seem strange at all.
Yeah. Well, the drone doesn't seem strange, but what the drone does is strange because it. I don't know, emits some kind of what looks like an electronic pulse of some sort, something that stops the van from moving.
Right.
And so it kind of freezes technology in a certain location, and that's where they get, the young man, the newbie, going now by the name Derek. And we assume that he's captured. I'm sure he'll appear in the second issue. We'll find out more of what's happening to him. But this first issue ends with Derek's father on the run.
Right. And the ending is odd because it doesn't feel like it's a climax. He's just looking at the street. I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure if I'm missing something here to what he's seeing on the street. He's seeing a cafeteria and a bar. That's about it. It doesn't. Maybe it's just because it's an empty street. Maybe it's just signaling wide open possibilities. I don't know, but it felt a little strange as an end to this first issue after everything that had happened so far.
Exactly, and it did seem incomplete for this reason, partially for me. Several pages earlier, when they're in the van, father and son, and they're getting away from the authorities. The smugglers have been discovered, their location, and so they're trying to get away. And Derek has a game plan, so he's telling his father what to do. He says, "Just stay off the main boulevard and find your way to Americatown." The title of the series. Get to We the People on Gringo Street and ask for Ignacio. He'll take care of you until I show up. Okay, so we're assuming that We the People is, I don't know, a restaurant, a bar, a hangout of some sort, but it's someplace in Americatown. Now, the question I have is where the father ends up, what you just described. He's on the street and he's looking down this boulevard. Is this the street that his son had told him? And he's looking outside of this bar because we see the sign that says bar. Now, is this We the People? I don't know. There's no indication that he's anywhere near where he needs to be. And I would think that one place to end a first issue would be somewhat near what his son had told him the location where he needs to be. In other words, there'd be some kind of hint that he may be close to his destination.
Or the fact that he has no idea where he's going, possibly.
Yeah.
And he's totally lost. And because there's no text at all, we don't have a thought balloon, we don't have a narration or anything like that. We just have this man looking down a street. I don't really know what we're supposed to feel at this point.
Well, we do have text that says to be continued.
Right, yeah.
Doesn't tell us much.
Yeah, so it seemed a more inconsequential ending than I was expecting, given everything that had come before. But again, I think a lot does happen in this first issue, especially as compared to Wolf.
Yeah, and this is a regular-sized first issue, so
right.
This is not a almost 60-page number one issue as we had with Wolf. So, Gene, we started off with the 6 Voyages of Lone Sloane from Philippe Druillet that came out recently from Titan Comics. Then a new Image title, Wolf. We looked at issues number 1 and 2, written by Alice Cott with art by Matt Taylor. And then we wrapped up with Americatown number 1, written by Bradford Winters and Larry Cohen with art by Daniel Irizarri from Boom Studios Archaea. So quite a spread of texts for this week.
Yeah, we hit a lot of your genres here. Not all of them, but a good number.
Yeah, and some genre mashups.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and a great way for you to mash up your comic genres is to go where we go, and that is get your comics at Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Go there. You're going to find some incredible specials, and you can't beat the prices that they have for funny books. Wonderful. So after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see on the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple to use. Or you can call us on the telephone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can email us. We're at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. And Gene, how can they get in touch with you?
Unsurprisingly, it's Gene at comicsalternative.com. G with a G.
That's right. You can also find us on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs. Thank you to everyone who continues to retweet our tweets. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. We also have a YouTube channel that you can listen to the podcast through those means. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com.
That's a whole lot of electronic ways of communication.
Yeah,
we got you covered.
That's right. And we like to be accessible in a variety of ways. And I mean that in a non-dirty sense, by the way.
I wasn't thinking that. Go about your business.
That's right. So, if you guys want to do what Rick Granger does and get in touch with us to let us know what you think about the podcast, whether you think that I'm the Kevin Smith of comics podcasting or not, we'd appreciate hearing from you. So please get in touch. Until then, though, I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene.
We will see you later.
Talk to you soon.